Several years after my real mother died, my aunt who took care of me died also. Meanwhile, my sister, whose only crime in life was a God-given beauty, could not tolerate the pressures of life and died at the age of 16.
و این همه غم و غصه و استبداد را که بر من، بر پدرش، بر مادرش، بر سایران می‌بیند.
The pressure of watching the cruel oppression of her mother and father and myself because of her was too much for her. When I was getting my religious study in Pakistan, I studied commentaries of the Quran and the Hadith and read the writings of different Islamic writers. Eventually, I went to Iran for my higher education and studied at the University of Tehran.
بالاخره مدتی که من برای تحصیلات عالی به ایران رفته بودم، در اونجا در دانشگاه تهران تحصیل میکردم، هم در این حال تحقیق میکردم مسائل مذهبی و سیاسی و فرهنگی و غیره و غیره را. در اون زمان من یک حالت متضاد دیگری را دریافتم که در جهان
I was also doing research in the religious, political and educational fields as well as in other issues. In those days, I realized that whereas in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Muslims are mostly Sunnis, by contrast in Iran, the dominant belief system was Shiite. And these two sects of Islam were as different as night and day. On occasion, this question would arouse in my mind that why were there two groups, the Sunnis and the Shiite Muslims? Why the differences? Why do the Iranians believe in Ali and his descendants as imams? Ali was the son-in-law of Muhammad and considered the first and only caliph, while in contrast, the Sunnis believe in four caliphs. I was puzzled over these differences and about who is right. Anyway, I picked a major in education and journalism at the University of Tehran, thinking to myself that educating people is the best way of freeing them from the bondage of ignorance that they remained chained to with the despotic rulers and oppressive governments. This was the only way I figured that I could serve the people, to let them know about today's pharaohs. Therefore, I spent almost 25 years, until around 1995, in the most remote areas of Afghanistan in teaching, educating, encouraging and persuading people of their rights, the rights of women, the rights of a mother. I was educating them as well as working with them to know that they are human beings with certain rights given to them by God to live in the society. My intention was, that is, I was doing my best to defend the rights of the poor women of Afghanistan who had been so oppressed in our culture. Many of them had been treated like slaves in the courts of men. Often, several women in one household had to serve the desires of one selfish, pleasure-seeking, ignorant man who called himself husband. They were being used as property and personal belongings. In the Quran, it refers to a woman as a kistar, meaning a farmland, which is a very insulting term for a woman. Later, we will discuss this more. We as a nation have experienced many times the power of colonizers and occupiers. They came and went. We should be careful not to replace one dangerous colonizer with another. Their blood is being wasted. We see now in history how when the Russian occupiers finally left by 1989, and after millions of lives were lost in order to rid us of these Russian criminals, how the government was then replaced by the power of Islamic occupiers. This caused even the regular Muslims of the country to be surprised. They created such a fear that was worse than before. When the criminal Mujahideen entered Kabul of Afghanistan, 1992, they did things to people that had never been seen in the sea of humanity. after the Mujahideen, a branch of the Al-Qaeda group called the Taliban, took over in 1996. They were supposedly the true devout Muslims and Islamic worshippers. They entered Afghanistan, and it got to the point that they occupied a big portion of the country. Before the Mujahideen and the Taliban took over, I was a teacher.
قبل از اینکه طالبان و مجاهدین بیاید من معلم بودم، وظیفه معلم داشتم در یکی از مدرسه های دخترانه. در آخرین روزهایی که من
and teaching at a girls' school. In the final days, right before the Taliban took over, 1996, I was teaching and involved in education and also started a library and bookstore. This was my way of making a living and at the same time teaching and illuminating people about being open-minded and aware of things. I would try to explain to people about their rights as a human being and as a citizen. I always considered freedom a God-given right of any human being. At this time of life, I lost my job as a girls' school teacher since the school was closed and the girls were driven to the corner of their houses in fear for their lives from war and in fear of being beaten and raped. At this point, I needed a job in order to have some kind of income to make a living and at the same time to continue with my goal of changing my world through a better quality of life. I wanted to do this by informing people of their rights and educating them for the better. I believe that if there is going to be a change in the country, it had to be a fundamental change. A change from the system of being ruled by the Islamic religious clerics, a change of the culture and occupying force put on us 1400 years ago by Islam. At this time, I still had Islamic faith, more or less, and had absolutely no contact with the Christian world, neither within our country nor outside. I never had access to a Bible and never read it or studied it. The only thing I knew about Christianity was what I was told in the Quran and from Islam. At this time, I went from Kabul to another city of Afghanistan called Herat. It was close to the Iranian border. It was a border city and business center. In that city, there was a businessman who imported books and reading materials from Iran for distribution throughout the country. I purchased 6,000 copies of a variety of books in a bundle from this wholesaler who got there from Mashhad and other big cities of Iran. They were all bundled together and packed together in big crates.
در کارتن ها و دستبندی هایی که خودشان کرده بود با هم قبلا هم رابطه داشتیم و داد و ستود و معامله داشتیم. گرفتم از اونجا این کتاب ها را انتقال دادم به شهر کابل.
I had done business with this person before. I brought all of these books to Kabul. I had started a bookstore in the center of the city. The name of this bookstore was Arya. I was putting the books away, realizing that these foolish mujahideen, these enemies of science and education and knowledge, not only do not like books, but also are against books. They are the enemies of books. They are the enemies of education, science, and civilization. At the same time, the atmosphere of the city had become so dark and gloomy that
چگونه نان دریافت بکنند و یا چگونه راهی فرار را از افغانستان پیدا بکنند تا صرف خانواده هایشان را از این وحشت و جهالت.
They were only concerned about how to make a living, enough to stay alive and not to starve. Or they were thinking of how to escape their oppressive city in the country so that they could save themselves and their families.